Once in the town of Babbia, there was a farmer named Tesfa. He was known as an enthusiastic man, but a silly one. One day, Tespa's wife told him that they would soon have a baby. And Tespa was highly elated. Nothing like that had ever happened to him before. But very shortly, he began to worry about what kind of child they would have. And so he questioned his wife. What kind of child will it be? But his wife couldn't give him any kind of a satisfactory answer.
"Stupid woman," he said. "We are having a baby and you don't know what kind? Well, I will have to go to the wise monk in the mountains. He will know."
So he took one of the young bulls from his herd and drove him to the cave in the mountains where the monk lived. The monk looked at Tesfa inquiringly.
"I come to you for information," Tesfa said. "My wife tells me we are going to have a baby, but the stupid woman doesn't know what kind of baby it will be. Please let me know the answer. I have brought you a bull for payment."
The monk took out his divining board and threw seeds upon it. This was the way he foretold the future. As the seeds fell upon the divining board, the monk shook his head. Tesfa shook his head, too. The monk clucked his tongue, and Tesfa clucked his tongue also. The monk took up the seeds and threw them again.
"Aha," he said. "Aha," Tesfa echoed.
Once more, the monk threw the seeds on the divining board.
"Ho-ho," he said. "Ho-ho," Tesfa replied expectantly.
At last, the monk looked up at Tesfa. He was very, very serious. "The child your wife will bear will be either a boy or a girl." Tesfa clapped his hands. "A boy or a girl? How fortunate I am!" He gave the monk the bull and ran home breathlessly to tell his wife the good news. And true to the monk's words, in the course of time, a child was born. And it was a boy.
"What a brilliant man the monk is," Tesfa said over and over. "How truly he spoke."
Soon the time came when they had to christen the child, but they couldn't think of a suitable name for him. When Tesfa proposed a name, his wife didn't like it. And when his wife suggested a name, Tesfa didn't like it. They couldn't agree at all. And finally, Tesfa said, "I'll ask the monk. He is so wise. The monk shall be godfather." So he took another young bull from his herd and went again to the cave of the monk.
"You have been so helpful in the past. Help me again," he said. "Please tell us our boy's name."
The monk brought out his divining board and threw seeds upon it.
"Aha," he said. "Ha-ha," Tesfa echoed.
"Oh-ho," the monk said.
"Ho-ho," Tesfa replied.
The man looked at Tesfa wisely. "Well?"
"What is his name?" Tesfa asked.
"Come close," said the monk. Tesfa came close. "I have the name," the monk said. "I will put it in your hands so that you won't lose it." Tesfa cupped his hands and held them out. The monk leaned forward and whispered into them.
"Close your hands quickly so that you don't lose it now," the monk said aloud. Yes, I am always losing things," Tesfa said enthusiastically. "Thank you, monk. We are deeply indebted. May you have many children and cattle."
And holding his hands together, he turned and ran homeward. When he came to a place near the village where the farmers were threshing their grain, he raced toward them, shouting,
I have it! How lucky I am! I have my son's name!"
But as he ran through the straw and chaff, he slipped and fell. And as he did so, his hands came apart.
Now I've lost it, he shouted at the farmers. See what you made me do.
He picked up a threshing fork and began to sift through the straw and chaff. Some of the farmers came to help him.
What does it look like, they asked. How do I know? I haven't even opened it, Tesfa said with irritation.
As they sifted through the straw, a woman of the village came by, and she asked what were they doing. Tesfa explained everything, and the woman shook her head.
It's simply ridiculous, she said,
and went on her way.
Is it really? Tesfa said with amazement.
Oh, thank you. And he dropped his fork and went home. His wife was waiting. Well, his wife asked, what is it?
I got it from the monk, but I dropped it on the straw, Tesfa said. While I was looking for it, our neighbor came by and told me it was ridiculous. So I didn't have to look anymore. How do you suppose she knew the boy's name should be ridiculous?
Once upon a time, there was a man who had a very big house. And in the house, there was a very big oven. But the man's family was small, only himself and his wife. When winter came, the man tried to keep his oven going, and in 1 month he burnt up all his firewood. He had nothing to feed the fire, and it was cold. So the man began to break up his fences and used the boards for fuel. And when he had burnt up all of his fences, the house, now without any protection against the wind, was colder than ever. And still they had no firewood. Then the man began to tear down the ceiling of his house and burn that in the oven. A neighbor noticed that he was tearing down his ceiling and said to him,
Why, neighbor, have you lost your mind? Pulling down your ceiling in winter? You and your wife will freeze to death.
But the man said, No, brother. You see, I am pulling down my ceiling so as to have something to heat my oven with. We have such a curious one. The more I heat it, the colder we are. The neighbor laughed and said, Well, isn't that silly? After you have burned up your ceiling, then you will be tearing down your house. You won't have anywhere to live. Only the oven will be left, and even that will be cold. Well, that is my misfortune, said the man. All my neighbors have firewood enough for the whole winter, but I have already burnt up my fences and the ceiling of my house and have nothing left. The neighbor replied, But all you need to do is to have your oven rebuilt. But the man said, I know well that you are jealous of my house and my large oven, and so you advise me to rebuild it. And so he turned a deaf ear to his neighbor's advice and burnt up his ceiling and burnt up his whole house. And in the end, he had to go and live with strangers. That's like giving all your food to a cat to keep the mice out of your food. A girl once went to the fair to hire herself a servant. And at last a funny-looking old gentleman engaged her and took her home to his house. And when she got there, he told her that he had something to teach her, for that in his house he had his own names for things. He said to her,
What would you call me?
Master or mister, or whatever you please, sir, says she.
He said, You must call me master of all masters. And what would you call this?
pointing to his bed.
Well, sir, bed or couch or whatever you please, sir.
No, that's my barnacle. And what do you call these?
Said he, pointing to his pantaloons.
Breeches or trousers or whatever you please, sir.
You must call them squibs and crackers. And what would you call her? Pointing to the cat.
Cat or kit or whatever you please, sir.
No, no, no. You must call her white-faced simony. And this now?
Showing the fire.
What would you call this?
Fire or flame or whatever you please, sir.
You must call it hot cockalorum. And what's this?
He went on, pointing to the water.
Water or wet or whatever you please, sir.
No! Pondalorum is its name. And what do you call all this?
Asked he as he pointed to the house.
House or cottage or whatever you please, sir.
You must call it High Topper Mountain.
That very night, the servant woke her master up in a fright and said,
Master of all masters, get out of your barnacle and put on your squibs and crackers, for white-faced simony has got a spark of hot cockalorum on its tail, and unless you get some pondalorum, high top a mountain will be all on hot cockalorum.
Which is even worse than Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Once upon a time, there was a mandarin who had a cat which he loved very, very much. He was so proud of the cat, and he considered it such a remarkable creature that he decided to name it Sky. One day a friend said to him, "Permit me to point out to you that there is something stronger than sky. I mean the clouds, for they hide the sky." "You are right," replied the mandarin. "And from now on I am going to give my most remarkable cat the name Cloud." Some time later, another mandarin was drinking tea at his house. "Why is it," he asked, "that you call this most remarkable creature Cloud? For there is something much stronger than the clouds. I mean the wind that scatters the clouds before it." So from then on, his master called the cat of which he was so proud by the name of Wind. But a week had not passed when the mayor of the town, whom the mandarin had invited to his house, noticed this quite remarkable cat. "Wind," he said, "seemed to me a name that is most unworthy of the merits of this extraordinary creature. The wind meets its master every day. I mean, the wall that it cannot blow through." "Ah, so," said the owner of the cat. "Henceforth, my most beloved pet will be called Wall." A little later, a scholar who was pursuing his studies at the mandarin's house respectfully remarked to the mandarin that there is something that can conquer even a wall: the mouse that nibbles a hole through it. "That is true," said the mandarin. "I will name my most remarkable cat Mouse." Just then the gardener's little son happened by.
Mouse? He exclaimed. I know something much stronger than a mouse. I mean the cat who catches the mouse and eats him up.
At this, the mandarin realized his folly, and from then on he called the animal of which he was so justly proud by the most beautiful name that anyone had been able to bestow upon it. The name of Cat. Once upon a time, there was a tramp. And this tramp had walked all day through the forest with little hope of finding shelter. And as he was growing tired and weary and was about to rest his body neath the sheltering shade of an oak tree, he glimpsed through an opening in the forest. And there he saw the twinkling lights of a little cottage. And he thought how nice it would be to be able to roast myself before the fire and get a bite to eat. And as he dragged himself wearily toward this cottage, he met an old woman coming toward him. The old woman stopped and looked at him and said,
Good evening. Where do you come from?
And the tramp looked up at her and said, South of the sun and east of the moon, I have been all over the world except for this parish.
Well, said the old woman, you must be a great traveler then. And what may your business be here?
Oh, said the tramp, I would merely like a little shelter for the night.
I thought as much, said the woman. But you may as well get away from here at once. The master of the house is not at home, and my place is not an inn.
Well, said the tramp, you mustn't be so hard-hearted, woman. We are both human beings, and we should help one another, shouldn't we?
Help? Help, she said. Who'll help me? I haven't had a morsel of food in the house, even for myself. No, you'll have to find shelter someplace else.
The tramp, however, was persistent. And although the old woman grumbled and complained, she at last gave in to his begging, and she said she would allow him to lie on the floor for the night. Now, when the tramp went into the house, do you know what he noticed? He noticed that the woman wasn't nearly as poor as she had pretended to be. She was only stingy and greedy. And the tramp, in his most agreeable manner, asked her for something to eat.
Where am I to get it from, said the woman. I haven't tasted a morsel of food myself the entire day.
But the tramp was a clever fellow. Poor old Granny, he said, you must be starving. Well, in that case, I suppose I must ask you to have something with me. The old woman looked at him.
With you? What have you got to offer, I'd like to know?
And the tramp said, he who far and wide doth roam sees many things not known at home. Lend me a pot, Granny. Now, the old woman became very curious, so she handed him a pot. And she watched him very carefully as he filled it with water, put it on the fire, and then out of his pocket, he took a 4-inch nail, turned it 3 times in his hand, and put it in the pot. The old woman stared incredulously.
What's this going to be, she said.
And the tramp said, nail broth. The old woman had never heard the like of that before.
And she said, well, that's something for poor people to know. I should like to learn how to make it.
And the tramp said, you only have to watch me. And he went on gently stirring the pot. The old woman squatted on the hearth, her eyes following every movement of his hand. This kind of nail generally makes good broth, said the tramp. But tonight, it is likely to be rather thin. You see, I have been making broth for a whole week with the same nail. And if I only had a handful of oatmeal to put into it, that would make it fine. But since there is none, there's no use wishing for it. And he went on gently stirring the pot. The old woman looked and said, "Well, I may have a scrap of oatmeal somewhere. Let me see." She went and fetched it. She did have oatmeal, and it was both good and fine. The tramp put in some of the oatmeal and went on stirring, while the woman still stared. "This broth would be good enough for company," said the tramp, adding more oatmeal. "If only I had a bit of salted beef and some potatoes." Oh, well, there's no use thinking about that. But the old woman suddenly remembered some potatoes she had put away, and perhaps a bit of beef as well. She gave them to the tramp and kept on stirring. And she sat and stared as hard as ever. "This will be grand enough for the best in the land," he said.
Well, I never, said the woman. And just fancy, all with a nail.
If only I had a little barley and a drop of milk, we could ask the king himself to have some of it. This is what he has every blessed evening, I know, for I have served under the king's cook.
Dear me, the king. Well, I never, she exclaimed, slapping her knee. She was quite awestruck by the tramp's fine connections.
But there's no use in thinking about what we cannot have, is there? And suddenly the old woman just happened to remember, that she had a little barley and that she wasn't quite out of milk. So she went to fetch the one and then the other. The tramp went on stirring, and the woman squatted down again and went on staring. Then all at once, the tramp took out the nail. "Now it is ready, and we'll have a real feast." Of course, the king and queen always had a bit of brandy and a sandwich with this kind of soup, and they always used a cloth on the table when they ate. But there's no use thinking of that. By now, the old woman was feeling quite grand and fine, and she thought it would be nice to have it just as the king and queen did for once. So she went straight to the cupboard and brought down the brandy bottle and glasses. She brought butter and cheese, smoked beef and veal. When she had set them out on her best cloth, the table looked as if it were decked out for company. Never in her life had the old woman had such a grand feast. Never had she tasted such broth. And just fancy, it was made with only a nail. She was in such a good humor at learning how to make delicious broth so cheaply that she couldn't make enough of the tramp who had taught her such a useful thing. They ate and drank and drank and ate until they both became tired and sleepy. The tramp started to lie down on the floor. But now that would never do. Such a grand person must have a bed to lie in. The tramp really didn't need much urging. "It's just like sweet Christmas time," he said. "And I have never met a kinder woman." He lay down on the bed and went fast asleep. When he awoke the next morning, coffee and a glass of brandy were waiting for him. And when he was going, the old woman gave him a bright and shiny coin.
"And thanks," she said. "Many thanks for what you have taught me. I shall live in comfort now that I've learned to make broth with a nail."
Well, it isn't very difficult if you only have something good to flavor it with. The old woman stood in the doorway, staring after him admiringly.
Just think. Wasn't I fortunate to meet such a man? Surely such people don't grow on every bush.
There was at this time, my friend, a great famine in the land. Now, in the land there grew a great tree with fine fruit. But it was known that this fruit would only drop when someone spoke the name of the tree. So as the famine grew worse and worse, The people came and lived near the tree, waiting for the fruit to ripen. When the fruit was almost ripe, it was found with dismay that no one knew the name of the tree. So they said, "Let us send the hare to the chief over the mountains in order that he might tell us the name." The hare accordingly set forth and soon reached the kraal of the chief over the mountains. And when he asked the chief for the name of the tree, the chief replied, "That tree is called Uwangalema. When you get back, stand beneath it and say, 'Uwangalema,' and the fruit will fall." So the hare hurried on his way back to his people, but he had not gone far on the path when he tripped over a root and rolled down the hill. And before he reached the bottom, the name of the tree had gone out of his head. He tried all the names he knew, and many others as he went along. What was it, he said? "Ulangalele wama, umalalele wangala, ulala wengli lolo hula wa, walo wengli lula." No. All the way he tried to remember, but when he arrived at the tree, although he tried many words, not one single piece of fruit fell. Now the people said they would send the springbok, for he was so swift he would return before he had forgotten the word. So the springbok set out and arrived there in no time. Then the chief told him, "That tree is called Uwangalema." And he started back as fast as he could to return to his people. But in his haste, he tripped over an anthill, and before he could pick himself up, the name was gone. He tried all the names he knew on the way, but in vain. "Ulala weli hula wange, wengili hula lama, lamili huwangalele lo." No, it was all in vain. When he got back, all he could say was, and that, of course, was no use. So the people said they would send the kudu, for he was stronger and would not fall on the way. So the kudu set out and soon arrived at the chief's kraal. The chief over the mountains told him, "The name of that tree is Uwangalema." And the kudu thanked him and started back. But on his way, he caught his horns in the branches of a tree. And while he was freeing himself, he forgot to say the word, and it went completely out of his head. And when he had freed himself, it was gone, disappeared. And when he returned to his people, he had to admit that he had forgotten it. The people now had a council, and they said they would send the lion, for he was both swift and strong, and he had no horns to catch in trees. The lion got the word from the chief over the mountains and started home, repeating the word over and over to himself. But the sun was hot, and he was tired, and he thought he would just lie down to rest in the shade of a bush, and he slept. But when he woke, the name was gone out of his head. Now the lion was too proud to admit he had forgotten the word, so he made up a word and said it many times to the tree. But no fruit fell. Then the people said, "Nonsense! There is no such word. You are no better than the others, for you have forgotten also." And they were very sad, for their hunger was growing and the fruit was ripening. At last the elephant said, "Let us send the tortoise." All the animals laughed, for they were sure no one so slow could remember. But the lion said, "No, let him go. Since we have all failed, it is best that he should fail also." But before the tortoise left, he went to his mother and asked her, "How does one remember a very hard word?" His mother said, "If you wish to remember it, son, do not stop saying it for any reason." After a long, long time, the tortoise reached the kraal of the chief over the mountains, and the chief told him, "That tree is called
Uwangalema.
The tortoise asked him again, and the chief told him yet again,
Uwangalema.
The tortoise asked him a third time, and the chief said the word yet again.
Uwangalema.
So then he set out saying the name to himself over and over again, and when he came to the anthill, he said, Uwangalema, as he went around it. When he came to the tree, he just went on saying it. And again when he came to the bush, although he was very tired and it was very hot, he only said, Uwangalema, and kept on. At last he reached his home, and his wife said, You are very tired. Will you not rest? But the tortoise said, Uwangalema, and went on. When he reached his friends underneath the tree, they all said, What is the name? Tell us the name of the tree. And he said, Uwelalong. Oh. He composed himself and thought very hard for a minute, and slowly it came out. Uwangalema. And the fruit immediately began to fall. And the people ate and were hungry no longer, and they said, We will make the tortoise chief over all the people, for he has brought us the name of the tree. And now, my friend, can you remember what was the name of that tree?